I'm gonna start recording now. Oh. Okay, I'm gonna start recording now. Stephen, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me perfectly fine?
Yeah.
All right. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking with Meghan, and Meghan has worked in the planning industry for over 12 years, providing development and local plans advice to local and private sector. Her advice is largely based on the housing sector. She enjoys coordinating and facilitating teams to deliver projects. And the diverse team at Women in Planning Southwest has become an online second family to her. And we are very lucky and honored to have Meghan today. And I hope you guys are ready for this because it's going to be really good.
Thank you. Thank you, Meghan.
Well, thank you ever so much for inviting me to speak with you all and sharing your time. I know how busy you all are at the moment. It feels like a very long time since I did any studying of any kind, but I remember well how difficult it was. I feel slightly very flattered by the intro, but also a bit unnerved by it because you hear any introduction to a planner and you think, God, is that all I do all day? And yes, that is all I do all day, is help people deliver things, and that's what I think what I do. And so I've already said that this may end up slightly rambling, but if I give you an overview of where I've come from, how I've got to where I am, and then we can just have Q&A, which is probably more interesting than just me burbling anyway. So I'm like many planners, ex-geographer. My mum was a teacher. I loved doing geography at school, slipped into a geography degree, the same university my mum went to, with the same course that my mother did, with some of the same lecturers, which is very alarming. And then when it came to postgraduate time, I had no idea what I wanted to do. My now husband decided he wanted to do a master's, so said, oh, you better do a master's so that you don't go into the workplace before I do, and found a course that he thought might be good for me. And then I ended up at Cardiff doing my degree in urban planning practice over there. How I ended up in private sector work was chance, really. I entered the workplace at the last financial crash in 2007, 2008, when there was no jobs, so few jobs around in planning at all. And I feel like now is a very similar time for a lot of planners. Hopefully not similar, because I would love for everybody to get jobs this year when they enter the workplace. But when I was looking back then, there was nothing. I was scraping the barrel trying to find any jobs being advertised anywhere, sending my CV out to all the employers I could find, in and around Hertfordshire, where I was living at the time with my parents, back here in Bristol, where I'd done my undergraduate and where I really wanted to be, and happily landed a job with a private practice over here in Bristol, having been told by an enforcement officer at a council I'd applied to that I wasn't robust enough to deal with enforcement work and to try elsewhere first. Slightly offended at not having been considered robust enough to do enforcement. I was very happy to be taken on by Tetlow King Planning, who are based out in East Bristol. They're a small practice with just 2 offices, but with a big presence. And I say that because it's interesting landing wherever you land and figuring out what makes that particular practice tick. And in the beginning, it was obviously a case of get a job, any job, anywhere, whoever will pay me to, be financially independent, and ended up just doing the work that was available. Tetlow King was pretty much stick planning applications in for anyone who'll come through the door kind of outfit, but also a fairly academic outfit looking at affordable housing and housing for older people predominantly. So a lot of my background has been in more academic ways of looking you guys will probably laugh at that, it's probably less academic than I think, but more academic ways of looking at how to deliver housing, and specifically affordable housing and housing for older people in the planning system. So a lot of my experience in the first 10 years of my working life was in writing local plan representations, advising clients on what planning policies were coming forward, how those policies actually work, and what kind of implications those policies would have for their day-to-day delivery of sites, whether that's looking at their forward flow when they're purchasing sites, or they've got a site coming on board now, they're about to develop it, but policy's changed and they might have to discharge conditions rather sooner than they thought they might have to. In the middle of my employment with Tetlow King, I got a little bit jumpy and managed to find myself some contract work with Bath and North East Somerset Council, which I managed to persuade them to contract me for rather than poach me. So Tetlow King contracted me out for a few days a week to do gypsy and traveller work for Bath and North East Somerset Council, and that was trying to bring on their site allocations document for gypsies and travellers. That, I have to say, whilst local sector work, which some people might look on as maybe easier than private sector, was two of the most challenging years of my career to date, both in terms of having to find my way through the quagmire of national policy and the politics of local policy, and trying to allocate sites for a sector of the community which is very, very prejudiced against by and large, and stirs up an awful lot of a feeling in communities. So later I'm perfectly happy to take questions on that, but I have to say definitely two of the most challenging years of my life, which resulted in some pretty nasty accusations from some members of the public and some members of the political arena at that point. All completely fine in the end, but after that I had a baby, took a year off, came back straight to Tetlow King, did a few more years there, and then got itchy feet and bounced across to DLP planning, which is where I am now. Being at DLP planning has been a completely different kettle of fish to my last place of work. I joined in September 2019, and 6 months later, what happened? COVID hit. So for the first 6 months of my time at DLP, it was mostly get on with the work that's there, find new clients, do normal planning work, planning applications, and that's gone between applications for changes of use of shops or other spaces, householder extensions, small scale stuff, through to the work that I was doing before we started this, which is part of a sustainable urban extension, putting in an application shortly for 500 homes and some employment uses on a site in Northamptonshire. So my experience at DLP has been really mixed, really mixed, really promising, really encouraging, really positive, and it's been fantastic in that way. It's really stretched me as a planner and the type of planning that I do. But of course, in the middle of that, COVID hit. So I joined an office with 6 planners. In the course of last year's troubles, 4 of them left, or of their own accord or otherwise. And so now it's just me and one other planner in our little office, working more as a satellite office with the support of the other offices in our company. So that's been really interesting from a different perspective, just in terms of having to step up, because I've become the most senior member of staff in that office, with clients looking to me for the advice, the responsibility of providing that advice to them, and administrative stuff. I do all of the billing and other bits and pieces that go with being the most senior person in an office. So again, happy to take questions on all of those aspects. One thing I should say is that when I was at Tetlow King Planning, I was one of the founder members of Young Planners Southwest, and that was largely just to create more of a network for myself and some friends really in the planning world, that I didn't have to look on as competitors, because in private practice it's very easy to see other companies and other colleagues in private practice as just solely as competitors and people to ignore or beat or do down because they work for somebody else and you'd rather have their clients than them have their clients. Young Planners was brilliant in introducing me to more planners on a very personal level across private and public sector. And I've been delighted to continue that with Women in Planning. I was, again, one of the founder members of Women in Planning. Everyone's going to think I don't have any friends when I say this. But reconnecting with some older friends and finding lots of lovely new friends to talk to and just become part of this planning network. And that was partly because Young Planners didn't fit me anymore. I'm going to sit far back from the screen so you can't see the wrinkles and the grey hairs, but I don't think I'm a young planner anymore. So Women in Planning has been a good, fun new way of engaging with people. That's probably all I wanted to ramble with, but absolutely happy to take questions from everyone here, or indeed following this when you distribute this presentation to other people.
Thank you. And I've got a question regarding to the challenges that you had, that you mentioned. What was it like working for those challenges?
Anyone in particular, or?
The one that you mentioned, you almost got accused, or...
Oh, yeah, that so one. The Gypsy and Traveller time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was interesting. So as I said, I did it for 2 years. I joined and took a development plan document through 2 stages of public consultation. The first one, nobody was interested. Issues and options stage. Nobody cares about the methodology for allocating Gypsy and Traveller sites until it bites. Second stage, looking at potential allocations. That's when the public obviously got interested, because we'd looked at sites that allocate for Gypsy Traveller unless they're already on semi-legacy housing. And so really council-owned land that we looked at, and the council owns land in all sorts of random pockets all over the district, and so they can pop up in all kinds of places, and the public in those locations was not too happy to find that we were considering putting a brand new Gypsy site or Traveller site next door to them. So public consultation was challenging because there was a lot of groups of people, crowds, being very aggressive, questioning everything I said, everything that my colleagues said. At some points there were members of the public with their cameras in my face, recording everything I was saying, being very aggressive in their manner with me. So that was challenging, just from a perspective of having to become quite resilient in public, being careful about what I said, thinking twice before speaking out loud, and abiding by the party line of this is why we're doing it and this is why it's important. Also challenging because there was a lot of racism, because Gypsies and Travellers are treated as, or not treated as they are, but can be separate races. And so there was a lot of racism chucked around either verbally or in written form. And so dealing with that meant brushing up on the Equalities Act, making sure that I dealt with that properly, returning representations that had been sent in if they contained racist commentary. So that was very interesting. The nasty end of that was being accused of being in collusion with certain people, resulting in sites being selected, which was obviously not the case, abide fully by my RTPI code of conduct. And that resulted in external auditing of the work that I'd conducted, which was a very thorough, interesting process. One I can advise always to avoid, because it's horribly painful going back over each and every one of your decisions that you've ever made and all of your written communications. But it was a really important lesson in why you have to be as transparent as you can in your career and stick to your morals, stick to your ethics, and pull people up on it if they're asking you to go against those morals and ethics. So happy to take any follow-on questions from that. But otherwise, challenges, there've been aplenty in the last year.
Yeah, I was just wondering, at the time, how was it? How did you find it? What methods were you using to separate your feelings and emotions from the difficult situation that you were in?
How did I cope with separating things? How do we ever cope, I imagine? Remembering why I was doing the job I was doing was a key point of it. And I know a lot of private sector planners get accused of going into private sector planning just for financial gain and whatnot. But wherever you're working, the planning work that you're doing has purpose. And so throughout that difficult period, it was reminding myself, yes, I'm being paid to do this job, and that's mostly why I'm doing it, but also because if you do a good job at this, somebody gets a home, or somebody gets a new office, or whatever they're getting out of it. There's something good coming out of it. And just sticking to that core belief and the morals and ethics, and reminding yourself that in an hour, that consultation will be finished. Or come 5 o'clock, I can leave my desk, shut my computer down, and go and do something else. And remember, planning isn't everything. And while it's easy to get caught up in it in the moment, you can just shut it down, walk away. No one's going to die if I don't do my job brilliantly. People will go without their houses a little bit longer. And so that's probably the most flip thing I can say today. But taking it seriously, but also remembering I'm just a small cog in the system. I'm not going to make that much difference. So I can afford to chill out a bit and just walk away sometimes.
Yeah. All right, thank you. I believe Megan has a question.
How do you have to take account to greenbelt and the MPPF policy there, because Baines is kind of within Bristol and the Greater Bristol area has a lot of greenbelt surrounding it?
Good question. Oh my God, greenbelt. It's the dreaded words, isn't it? Along with areas of outstanding natural beauty. Well, for the gypsy work, of course, there's there's the framework, but there's also planning policy for traveller sites, which has slightly different guidance in that about how you can deliver gypsy and traveller sites in the greenbelt, which has slightly, or it did when I was initially looking at this back in 2013, slightly less onerous rules for how you bring forward gypsy sites in the greenbelt. It's been a while. This was back in 2013. I had my baby, so I've not very recently brushed up on my greenbelt rules for that. But yeah, you have to go through a very strict process of assessing, why is this site in the greenbelt? Which of the 5 purposes does it serve? And are there benefits to bringing forward this site in the greenbelt that outweigh the harm that you're causing to the greenbelt? But yes, essentially, working in Bath and North East Somerset, you're going to come up against World Heritage issues as well as the greenbelt issues, and it's going to feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall a lot of the time. I know that a lot of the work that I've done in and around Bristol, Bath, and in other areas with greenbelt, it is very, very difficult. There's a very high bar set for developing, and overcoming it requires rigour, an awful lot of paperwork, an awful lot of justification, reviewing against other appeal decisions, looking at High Court judgments, and just writing it all out longhand and trying to be really, really thorough. that is one thing I would say to anyone in their planning career is, if you can have a good grasp of where the planning law is at the moment, it's a really good thing to have in your back pocket. There are so many occasions where I've been in a discussion with a planning officer or at appeal, and you got that golden High Court judgment in your back pocket that says, I can do X because this judge said so. And that really helps tip things in your favour occasionally, unless they find a reason not to agree with you. Is that any help at all?
It was really useful. Yeah, it just seems really amazing how this urban containment policy, which is almost what it is, I think the MPPF was 2012, the one, and then it went forward, and it's kind of almost got stronger as time progressed. It feels amazing that a lot of people are kind of seeing greenbelt as more of a phenomenon of the geographical nature rather than the actual idea that it's more political in its stance of the fact it's not all green bunny rabbits. There's literally sites out there which are not pretty, but because they're vast, they count as greenbelt.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a humongous mammoth in the room. It's so difficult to get around. And one thing that will have to be dealt with in and around our major cities and other areas across the next decade, it will have to be faced at some point. It doesn't matter how much the government puts a number on how many houses we build each year. If it can't loosen its grip on the greenbelt at some stage, and it's probably a different government that will have to grapple with that, then it's just not going to achieve the numbers it needs. When I first came into planning, we still had regional spatial strategies, and I remember going to the examination for the West Midlands RSS and being baffled by this monolithic document which was trying to do regional development and understanding greenbelt and releasing in proper places, and then that all got scrapped with the advent of the MPPF. And look where we are. We've got the Oxford-Cambridge arc. What's that like? It's a bit like regional planning, maybe? So it's interesting. Planning's coming full circle again. And greenbelt, it'll have to slip at some point. It's so frustrating as a private sector planner having to deal with the politics around it and trying to get planning permission, whatever size development you're trying to get. It's just... Hello, brick wall. Nice to see you again.
I think I just thought of a follow-up question as well, especially for this regional idea. It's quite interesting that there's different tiers of governance, and the fact that we have a mayor for Bristol and also the mayor of the whole of the west of England. It almost feels like they allocate their funds, and it's quite interesting how maybe the aspect of devolution should come into it, how we should probably consider the MPPF, but also consider the needs of a local area, especially because different parts of the UK has different almost specialisms, like creative industry or like what they used to be known for. So it's quite interesting that we should think about the needs of the people within the area and not just the UK or the Wales and England as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting to see how everything's changing. Of course, Bristol used to be Avon, and used to be just one unitary authority. Then it devolved into all of these districts, and then it all changed again with having the mayoral places. It's been an interesting decade, I have to say, with a lot of change with the district councils and former county councils, and then becoming unitary authorities. That's created an awful lot of interesting scenarios, say in like Wiltshire and Cornwall, where we had lots of district authorities which had their own unique identity and their own ambitions for what they would deliver for housing, employment growth, leisure, all of those things, suddenly being lumped into a unitary authority and having to cope with having one voice for still very disparate communities The way that's filtered through planning has been interesting to watch. I mean, in Wiltshire, it's still a very strange position where you've got ex-district authorities having to deal with their housing growth completely differently because of old assessments of how they have need and how they should deliver need. It's going to continue being a pain in the backside, I think. We've still got so many local plans hanging over from that period prior to their unitary status. Yeah, sorry, that was just a bit of a rant about changes of authorities. See another hand.
Yeah, I would like to ask, can we have a little insight of your day-to-day work and how is it like?
What's that like? So prior to taking charge of the office and working in an actual office and not in my home environment, come in, have a natter, same as everybody else, say hello to everybody, have a jobs run through with colleagues, what you're working on today, who's got capacity, what we're going to prioritise, which client's being a pain in the backside, who do we need to handle with care today. Then getting into the meat and veg of work, dealing with emails, responding to ad hoc client queries, writing a planning statement, writing an appeal statement, all the nuts and bolts of planning, and overseeing colleagues doing the same. The day-to-day life now seems to be more wake up, move from my desk, sit there for 12 hours, move away from the desk, have dinner, move back to the desk for a bit more, and then go to bed. It's not quite that bad. But so my day-to-day life, if I talk about today, I spent the first couple of hours in project team meetings, talking to other officers about what we're working on, what our priorities are, what our capacities are for the next few weeks. I'm meant to be taking 2 weeks leave from the end of this week for Easter, but I'm having to cancel, I think, part of my leave next week because the big planning application submission that was meant to be going in this week is going next week, which means everybody's reports are delayed, and it'll give me a couple more days to prepare them, upload to portal, and submit. So project team meetings this morning, and then most of today has been spent actually receiving updates to an environmental statement from either internal colleagues or the client or other consultants, and then just doing track changes to that report, which has grown to a mammoth 100,000 words now. So competing with my bandwidth and computer speed to keep that going has been interesting. But largely it's what most planners do. I tend to think it's dealing with emails, answering calls, responding to the random questions you get from a client of, do I need planning permission to do this? Which generally means looking it up on in the permitted development rights order, or looking in the framework and checking that paragraph, or checking the local policy. That's one of the interesting things, I suppose, about being a private sector planner is, unlike my public sector colleagues, I have to bounce between local authority areas according to where my clients want us to look. A lot of my work has traditionally been based in the west of England, so I've got to know the local policies fairly intimately. But more recently, my work's taken me all over the country. So I've had to, pick up a new joint core strategy and all its component parts and look up the SPDs and try and figure out how all of that links together. So that's part of what keeps it fresh in private sector planning, I think, is having to skip around and figure out what on earth I'm meant to be looking at today, and how to cope with that.
What skills do you usually bring it to you when you're moving to different part of the city for different projects?
Sorry?
So what kind of skills would you bring on with you when you're moving to different kind of projects?
Oh, what skills do I have as a planner, you mean? Who knows? I've no idea while I'm still paid. Yeah. And genuinely, that's a question I ask myself a lot of the time. What do I actually contribute to this job? I'm not sure. Imposter syndrome is real, whatever level you're at, by the way. Every level. Everyone I've ever talked to across planning or any industry still suffers from imposter syndrome, unless their ego is like the size of a house. The skills I bring as a planner, I'm fairly literate. I'm fairly good at writing. So putting across a case in a planning statement or an appeal statement or writing a committee speech or just having a bit of a gift of the gab when you're talking to consultees or your counterpart in the planning authority, being able to pick up what I'm actually meant to be doing, what the policy is saying, what we're trying to achieve, and weave that into a kind of story to whoever I'm talking to. I think that's the main skill that planners have, actually. It's not just being able to read a plan and understand it. It's being able to translate that into why are we doing this? What's the purpose? Who's going to benefit? And how little affordable housing and or other contributions do I have to accept on this to get a result for the client, which always feels really horrible.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, is it harder to separate yourself from your job now it's all virtual and then at home, or was it easier when you're in the office and you could kind of separate there, or did you used to still do planning work at home when office work was still then?
Yeah, when I was working in the office, I'd have a work phone, so I'd always have my emails on me if I felt inclined to look at it. But I have to say the workload over the last year has gone from manageable to, oh yeah, that's what it's like when your team shrinks and you still have to produce the same level of outputs. I find it much harder to separate home from work now that I'm working from home, because I've got everything set up. The computer's always at hand. My phone's always at hand for clients to attempt to reach me. It's a lot harder. I think occasionally I do it quite well in thinking, no, I'm actually going to set myself a limit today and I'm only going to work until X time, and after that point I'm going to shut everything down, I'm going to turn my phone off, or I'm going to put my out of office on and actually be realistic about my office hours and just tell the clients, sorry, I'm out of the office right now, you'll have to wait until tomorrow, which actually works quite well. You've got to remember sometimes that people do respect boundaries if you set them.
I think reflecting on that, do you think Boris Johnson's statement a little while back, a couple of days ago, when they said how technically we're not working when we're at home, is almost ridiculous, because it almost feels like we're doing more work at home. I definitely felt like that when I've been doing university work. I could sit down and not realise I sat down for 12 hours, and just like there's so much to do sometimes. It's amazing that if you give yourself an awareness and scope of how much you know you've got to do and trying to get it done at certain times and intervals, it's really hard to try and separate yourself when you're maybe needing to reach that next achievable goal, or like trying to find that limit or that boundary.
Oh yeah, I've often found myself, if I've worked up until the point where I've had dinner at home, either served for me because my husband's brilliant, or I've had to go and cook dinner for me and the family, and then I've come back to just do another 15 minutes, or I just do that email, oh it took a bit longer, or I just do that extra bit of track change to that document 2 hours later, or like looking at your watch and thinking, cripes, it's 11:30, why am I still at my desk? Boris's announcement that everybody working from home is not really working from home generally smacks of ignorance to me, because I don't know anybody, and it's all your own circle. Many people working from home or having been furloughed last year will have sat on their high knees doing nothing, and that's fine, that's great. If you're on furlough, you shouldn't have been doing anything anyway. But for the vast majority, I imagine they're like me, working their absolute socks off, because if you're in the private sector, you're measured against what you produce, so you have to produce, and the client's expectations aren't going to decrease just because your team shrank. So you still have to hit the same targets, you still have to give the same level of customer service, be friendly at all times, be welcoming. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I can hit that target. Yeah, I can do that. Not a problem. It's so much harder now. But hopefully, as work continues to stabilise in the industry, and it does seem to be, there will be continued growth again, so we can all get back to work and employing more graduates and employing other people to do more of the work that takes more of my time when I should be doing other things.
Hi. So just now you mentioned employability, and that's exactly what I was thinking. Basically, I was wondering what would be the best approach to ask for work experience, whether it would be like best to email a direct person or possibly spam a firm, or is there any kind of technique you would suggest that would be?
I think so I've got to caveat this and say I'm not an employer, so I'm still very much a cog in the system rather than at the manager level. So I've never been in the position of having to get anyone in or search for new people to employ. But having seen people be employed in my last job and my current one and seeing how that kind of works, I have to say at the moment, just an email direct to a named contact in the organisation works well. You've got to find that one person that seems to head up that office. Try not to hit the graduate planner who hasn't got a clue and may not even pass your email on because they're worried about preserving their own job. But yeah, direct contact seems logical to me. Where people have got the need for people, they will try and bring you in if they can, especially if it's on low wages. Is that helpful at all?
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. I was wondering, what advice would you have for someone new to the industry?
In respect of anything in particular?
Let's just say new, let's just say a graduate, a recent graduate, and planning on to moving into the industry as a planner.
So advice for finding a job or where to go or any and all of the above? So yeah, so just as a reflection on where I was at, my suggestion is to apply everywhere. Don't discriminate at this point in your career. Everything's open wide in theory, and there are so many opportunities to learn different aspects of planning and different approaches to it from all the people that are operating in it, that I would cast your net as wide as possible. Particularly at the moment, there doesn't seem to be much emphasis on being local. So there's no real need to, if you're living in or around Bristol at the moment, restrict yourself to the west of England. Some opportunities can be found sitting at home, staying in Bristol for the foreseeable and working in Sheffield, say, because we're all online now. So try not to restrict yourself wherever you're looking. Look public, look private, look third sector. There are charities out there that do planning work. I know a former colleague of mine on the Young Planning went into private sector, having been in public sector with me, and bounced onto a charity because they hated the private sector company that they were with, didn't like the culture there, and then bounced onto a local authority elsewhere, and they've had a great time. Spread yourself wide, enjoy the journey at this point, because there's no point, in my view, unless you're saddled with enormous debt, which I know you all are with student loans, sorry, there's no point restricting your outlook at this time. Look to where you can learn rather than necessarily where the highest wages are or the best bonuses or whatever. Find people to learn from, because that's what's been invaluable to me. I always say I haven't got a clue what I know, but I know where to find it. And I've learned from some brilliant people, brilliant planners, who've just given me a different perspective on how to answer questions or how to approach clients or how to approach local authorities. So if when you get your first rung on the ladder, don't sit there necessarily for 10 years like I did. Find new people to learn from and go and hang your saddle on their hook for a while.
Thank you. And then I have another one. Do you have, when you were new into the planning industry, did you have anyone who inspired you? And then is the person who inspired you then still the same now? And if not, then who is it now?
Who inspires me in planning? Oh, crikey. Well, now I don't really get much chance to lift my head above the desk to figure out who my inspiration is. I'm not in the most positive mindset about planning these days, just because the last year's been so tough emotionally. It's been really, really hard. So I wouldn't say I necessarily have anyone as an inspiration at the moment. But then colleagues, I've always say colleagues continue to teach me new things, and the other women in planning teach me new things about planning, even when we're on a general WhatsApp chat and we're whinging about each other's careers, and whinging about the problems we're having at the moment. I would say that my original managing director was a bit of an inspiration. I don't like to say it too much because his head was always enormous anyway. But Robin Tetlow was a bit of an inspiration because he was so at ease with what he knew, or he seemed so at ease with what he knew. He'd been in the sector, the company was as old as I was, so it'd been around a while. He'd met a lot of people, he'd learned from a lot of people, and he was free with his advice. He was happy to share it and teach you. So while all of the red line, and back then it was literally, I'm going to print a copy of what you've written, scrawl on it in red pen and give it back to you and try and decipher the handwriting. Even though we got lots of scrawl from him, it was always with a view to us learning to be better and learning how to communicate more effectively. So I'd still say he's a bit of an inspiration, actually. I still use all the Latin terms he taught me.
Yeah. Thank you.
I feel like I should have some really big female inspirational characters in my roll call, but really the other women in planning are brilliant. So them.
Do you have any sorry.
It's okay.
Do you have any next steps in your career?
So it's a big question for someone that's being recorded. Where's this recording going?
I can stop right now.
If it's only being distributed around you, it's fine. Who knows? There's always a who knows big question mark. Because there's the opportunity to stay put and continue pushing my office forward, which is a brilliant opportunity. I have to say, at my age and my position, it's been fantastic. So whilst the last year has been full of hardship and emotionally, personally, to keep up and to keep going, it's brilliant. I haven't got anyone above me in my office to tell me no, and I can talk to the people I want to talk, do the work that I want to do, ignore the clients that I really don't want to work with and just go, don't want to do that. Or I could find somewhere else. So there could be other private sector companies, or there could be different organisations. There's lots of work around at my kind of height, my kind of level at the moment. So there's lots of opportunities out there, but I'm not looking. It's just a case of keep going, see where I get to, and see if I can make a good fist of where I'm at the moment. Who knows? But that's just my personal outlook. I'm pretty relaxed at just earning the money I have and just finding out where it takes me.
That's good. Megan has a question.
I was going to ask, was your mum a geography teacher as well?
Yeah, she was.
My mum used to be a geography teacher too, and she did a geography degree. She finds it funny how I found planning because I was set on being an architect for most of my life.
Oh, interesting.
But then I went, I'm a property development and planning student, so it's quite interesting how I almost want to do everything. But do you have anyone in your family or like immediate family who worked within the industry that you decided that you wanted to go into planning with, or did surveying work? Because my uncles did a lot of surveying, and it's quite funny how I got into it afterwards anyway.
No, yeah, that is interesting. And I think a lot of people get into planning because their close relatives are in the sector in one way or another. And it's brilliant, really, because who would find out about planning if they didn't know a family member that was doing it? It's a really invisible industry. And trying to describe to people what I actually do as a job is really both dull and difficult, because you ask, what do you do as a planner? I sit and I write a few things and I talk to people all day. It's pretty much summation of what I do. But the question, no, I mean, I really wasn't inspired by anybody to go into planning except being told by my now husband, this course looks reasonable, you'd be good at it, go and have a look, do the course, figure it out, see if it fits you. So I really did fall into it by accident. Although having then gone into planning, I did actually discover a bit belatedly that my grandfather was, which I knew, was a councillor for the neck of the woods up in Cheshire, and had actually sat on an awful lot of planning committees in his time. So having gone into planning, I then ended up having a lot of conversations with him about how planning works, but I hadn't known about it beforehand, so it was happenstance, really.
Yeah, I think a lot of people go into planning as a postgrad because it's such a really interesting way to get into it. Because I did a politics A-level rather than like a geography one, and I was like, this is a really interesting way to look into things in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. You can fall into it from so many different disciplines. Or, you know, go into it with determination, which some strange people do.
Another question. I was wondering about specification, because I know like the planning world is like very much big, and basically there's a lot of options. And I was looking into a few different roles, and one of them was in the public sector as an EIA advisor. And I know that they do recommend you to get specification on environment or air quality assessments and such. But how about the price? Is there like kind of a requirement to do certain specifications? Like maybe if you want to be a planning consultant, I'm trying to think of one now, but possibly like town planning and like basically do you have to do like a master's as well, or?
So as a planning consultant, you will basically need to be chartered at some point in your career to progress. And I mean a chartered member of the RTPI. And to become a chartered member of the RTPI, you basically, I might be slightly out of date because I know there's other routes into it these days, but you basically need to have a certain qualification, which is generally a master's in town planning, or whichever frame it is put in, to become chartered, and then have your 2 years of postgraduate work to complete your APC process. But of course, not all planning practices will require you to be chartered. Not everybody will require you to even be a member of the RTPI. An awful lot of public sector planners don't become MRTPI or even hold RTPI status at all, because there's not a lot you get out of it, or it can seem that way. So basically, having the degree in planning and then doing your RTPI accreditation is the best way in. within private sector practice. Does that help at all?
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just making
No
notes.
question on that front.
Thank you.
Anyone else with more questions? You have a question, Justin?
Oh, no. No, you can go ahead.
You do have a question? No? Okay. Where do you see the planning industry going in the future?
A small question. Oh God, look at my crystal ball and try and figure out if I know what I'm talking about. Not really. Where do I see it going? Oh, it doesn't seem to be moving anywhere particularly fast. So having been in it for, where am I now? Coming up to 13 years, lucky 13, in the industry. And what's happened, we've gone from planning practice guidance or planning policy guidance through to planning policy statements through to the MPPF Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, planning white paper. There's still not much that goes on that's changed very much. I mean, the only real change that I've seen is the acceleration of permitted development rights and the general bite of the employment and other units that are out there converting to residential. It will continue. I hope that at some point there's a general revolt against this snippy snip on planning, because it makes my life harder trying to keep up with the changes in rules and regulations. It's an absolute nightmare trying to figure your way out through the GDPO with all of its revisions. It makes public sector planners' lives much harder, especially as they're so under-resourced these days. And politicians don't really get much out of it because it doesn't have much of an effect. Planning will continue as it is for the next 10 years, I should have thought, unless something meteoric happens. Yeah. I can't really say much more than that, and certainly nothing inspirational, sorry.
All right, thank you. Rafa has a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So basically, I was wondering, what is like your favorite part of the job? Like, do you have a particular document you're like quite keen on working on, or because I did some like work experience and I did it in the public sector, and I know there's like certain areas which I'm quite keen on because I'm like quite familiar with, and it's like super straightforward. Meanwhile, there's like the NCP,
NSIPs.
Yeah. And I definitely don't like them. I'm not very keen on that for the smaller cases. So, yeah, wondering if you...
No, that's an interesting question, because I think two of my colleagues and women in planning in particular are big NSIP, DCO, infrastructure planning geeks. And I mean that in only the positive sense. They love that stuff, and they love environmental planning, and they just eat, drink, live it, and it's just their bread and butter, and yes, give me more. And if I ever dare to talk to them about it, they'll just end up giving me a lecture, so I don't talk about it. Because talking about planning outside of work can get quite boring. My favourite parts, it's an interesting question actually, because a lot of what I love, the day that I come away from my desk, because I can't leave the office, feeling invigorated, rejuvenated, really positive about my day, is actually when I've spoken to lots of people about different projects and answered different questions. One of my favourite things is being asked an obscure question. Can I do whatever it is? And then me having to go and figure it out. So whilst, yes, it can be an absolute pain in the rear to go and figure out the answer, and try and figure out whether that's the actual answer. If I'd been able to go away and research it and find a reason and look at appeal decisions and think, right, this is the strategy for achieving whatever it is you want to achieve, and this is how we're going to do it, or this is the definitive answer. So I've had a day where I've done at least one of those kinds of questions. or I've spoken to lots of people and had a productive meeting and gone, right, this is what we're going to do with this project. This is the problem we've had. This is the consultee comment that we've had, and this is how we're going to resolve it. That for me is a brilliant day. That's where I come away from work going, oh, that was a good day. I actually feel well equipped to do my job, like I understand what I'm doing, and actually maybe I added value to that project for a change, rather than just sat there going, I haven't really achieved anything today, which I do generally feel a lot of the time when I've just sat there and I've tracked changes on documents, which is generally quite tedious. I used to enjoy it quite a lot, but now it's just a bit, I'm not really creating much, not really having much faith that anybody's going to even read the document at the end of the day. One of the most soul-destroying things, I think, being a private sector planner is spending hours on a planning statement. You just know nobody is going to read at the other side, except maybe an objector who just wants to figure out how many mistakes you've made or how many inconsistencies there are between the different planning documents. And that's frustrating. But otherwise, yeah, if I've had a day where I've talked to lots of people, quite apart from the fact that that doesn't happen enough these days, that's a really good day. So actually, that's a good point, is figuring out what you enjoy. And that's not figuring out what you enjoy today, because it might be that in the next year when you've got into a job or you've gone bounced between jobs, you figured out different things that you like. And it might be that you like that thing with that employer. And actually, if you go to a different employer, you might not enjoy it quite so much because their approach is different, or they're expecting different things from you, and you might enjoy different things with them. But if you can figure out what aspects of planning you like, and you can follow your nose to that kind of work, then you're onto a winner. And this is mostly why I've stayed within the private sector. Public sector, you don't get to bounce too much. Like policy work, snooze fest to me. Absolutely no interest anymore, none whatsoever. Private practice, I get 10 different projects in a day, 10 different clients ringing me up wanting an answer yesterday. Brilliant.
Oh, cool. No, that's good. It's good to know as well, because then I get more familiar. So yeah, hopefully. Sorry, I have one question. So basically, do you have to refer a lot back to MPPF, like when you're looking into proposals or like possible applications?
There's a lot of referring to Section 38(6) of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act. Every planning statement's policy section will start with that statement. The development plan is primacy, has primacy, and the material consideration is the MPPF. So yes and no. So with a lot of the work that I do, say in Bristol, where I'm putting in more minor planning applications, although incredibly important to those clients, minor in the scale of things, I will be much more looking at what Bristol's core strategy says, what its site allocations DPD says, what all of its SPDs say, and that has so much more weight than what the MPPF is saying, because when I'm looking at all of those SPDs, that's what the officers will be looking at. They don't care what the MPPF says. Their development plans in accordance with the MPPF. So it's just that's just the framework. But their meat and veg is what the local plan says. And if their local plan is saying we don't like houses which are 3 stories high in this area, then they don't give a monkeys if the housing land supply position is bad. They care that you're proposing something that's going to break their local plan, and they're going to say no. So it depends on what work you're doing and who that local authority you're approaching is. But ultimately, if you're working on something that doesn't quite agree with the local plan, then you're going to have an uphill battle trying to convince them that the framework tells them to do something else.
I see. No, that's good to know. Because in my head, I always thought you have to reread the whole NPPF and like, that's good. That's good.
I mean, obviously, it's good to have an overarching knowledge of the framework and all of its component parts, but because it informs everything we do. But ultimately, it's the local plan policies, unless they've been absolutely blown out of the water by an appeal inspector recently. You still have to be thoroughly in accordance with them for them to give your proposal any consideration.
Oh, okay. I'm also talking about appeal. Sorry, one last question, because I know we're going a bit over time. basically for hearings, when it's like firstly, I wanted to ask, have you ever like had to represent in a hearing? Because I've watched them before, and I feel like sometimes it can be a bit intense. So, yeah.
Yes, I've not had to shoulder that burden entirely on my own yet. I've managed to avoid it by telling people to go to representations or just to not bother appealing, or to go to inquiry and do it with someone else. But yeah, I've sat in the box with an inspector and talked conditions and legal obligations, and been the one talking to the inspector and saying why those conditions are necessary or unnecessary or whatever. Yeah, it is intense. It was one of those moments in my career where I just sat there and got the absolute fear that the inspector could look at me and just know she's not done this before and she doesn't have a clue what she's doing. Ultimately, one of the things that we have to remember as planners is your own personal fears don't come into it. They're not important. What you're doing, whichever side of the fence you're on, is you're presenting your case. And as long as you've read your case, you understand your case, and you present it factually and without emotion, that is what is going to convince people of it. It's nice to say that I still absolutely had the fear on the day and was shaking all over the place going, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to keep going and following my notes anyway. And just hoping that the inspector just goes with it. Because the inspectors don't care. They've seen it all before. They're human beings too. But that applies in whatever frame you're in. Whether you're doing your first hearing, public inquiry, presenting to you lot. I was still nervous before the start of this, thinking I'm going to just talk a load of nonsense. But whichever format you're in, you're just a person talking to other people about something, in theory, you know far more about than they do. So when it comes to giving your first presentation or going to your first hearing or whatever, I think one bit of advice I would always have for people is, as long as you know your stuff and you can talk about your stuff, you'll be fine. Don't go beyond that. Don't bluff. Don't think I can blag this. You can't, you'll come unstuck. Talk about what you know and learn it properly so that you can talk around it. And that's what I try and do. And wherever I am, just be prepared.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep that in mind for sure.
Right. I have a question. It's more going to be about your opinion than anything else.
These are all my opinions. This is not any reflection on my employer or anyone.
Right. So I can't remember where I got this info. Well, I got it from Instagram as we scrolling through like a post, and it was mentioning how trees can like help economies' wealth, like planting trees. Do you think that's true? Because they didn't have any like further reading on that topic or evidence to support it.
Do I think trees improve the economy?
Yeah.
You ask the really easy questions, don't you? It's got to be a biased bit of research. You walk down any tree-lined street and chances are it's tree-lined because it was built 100 years ago when that builder decided, I fancy having trees on this street because it will make it easier for me to sell it. I can have a bit of a premium for a tree-lined street. It doesn't matter where in the country you are. That will have been the builder's insight. So those streets end up being more appealing, more desirable, more attractive, and generally end up becoming the hubs for better economic health. So I wouldn't necessarily say trees improve the economy, more that the economy will go to where the trees are. So with the National Model Design Code, I think it was saying that every new development should have tree-lined streets. That is going to be slightly unworkable because you ask any developer to plant trees and they'll kind of go, okay, we'll plant a few trees on this street, but it'll come out of the baseline and therefore we'll end up contributing less to other pots of money. And on the other side of it, you've got a highways authority saying, I don't want to adopt the trees. they're a pain to maintain over the next 20 years, don't want to do it. And then you end up with management costs. You end up with service companies being required to manage those trees for the next 20 years, and just the cycle of having to pay for these things continues. So for the next few years at least, that's going to create its own difficulties. I would like to think that more trees would get built on developments because they are brilliant. Trees should be built everywhere, planted everywhere, but they create a huge problem of management cost for the developer, costs that then get passed on to the owners and the occupiers and the affordable housing tenants. It's problematic. So yeah, it's not a straightforward transaction.
Yeah. Just what did you mean by baseline? Like what's included in the baseline?
Oh, so I mean like basic development viability. So a developer will have paid the landowner a baseline cost for that site and then have an uplift value in that for how much is created out of that development getting planning permission. And then they've got to lump all of their construction costs on top of that, as well as all of the costs of paying people like me to do the planning work, paying their lawyers to do the lawyering, etc., etc., etc. And then on top of that, you've got to put the planning obligations for paying towards the local access being upgraded, or paying for the education contribution, paying for the affordable housing as well. That all comes out of the developer's profit, and paying for trees is just yet one more thing to come out of the baseline costs of development.
Thank you. Meghans has the question.
I think it's almost a follow-on question. So as well as being in a housing crisis at the moment, we're also in an ecological crisis. So it finds it quite interesting how maybe there should be this paradigm shift to think clearly there's not just economic capital, there's also social and environmental capital, and how important the surrounding areas are for our own mental health. So I think it should be good for developers to think that it's not a bottom line problem, it's a problem that will actually uplift their housing values in the end anyway.
Oh yeah, I mean there's many things coming through the system these days that should in theory improve all of the developers' bottom lines, because in theory, including electric vehicle charging points, having more tree-lined streets, having better public open space on a site, having better dark corridors on a site to improve bat foraging opportunities, all of that should produce better places with more of a community feel to them, and that should in theory drive up prices on houses and what you can get for it at the end of the day. So you think all these things will hopefully drive up placemaking and drive up the ecological and other benefits. Getting the developers to catch on to that takes time, because of course costs are still high for delivering quite a lot of that stuff. So even if you're looking at a vast tract of greenfield land, plugging in a huge amount of public open space, plugging in biodiversity net gain, can still be very onerous. You've got at the moment, well, across the country, you've got phosphates issues, payments to places to make sure that too many new residents don't go traipsing through the local national park and causing trouble for the greater horseshoe wading ducks or whatever it is. There's lots of that going on at the moment. Somerset's having a problem in that there's a lot of bats in Somerset. And so you don't just have to do biodiversity net gain, you have to make sure that you're providing more space for the bats to continue living there. But the local authorities don't have any way of telling you how to do that. So every developer in Somerset at the moment is having to figure out, how do I do this for the bats? And then having to go and find more land off-site to deliver the benefits for the bats. So we are at a funny old position in planning at the moment, not just with the greater sustainability aims and dealing with the ecological crisis, the ecological and sustainability crisis, but in dealing with all these tiny bits and pieces that aren't quite bolted together yet. and everyone having to rewrite their own book each time, which is, of course, slowing down the delivery, which means that the housing crisis is just getting further embedded. So, yeah, there's a lot going on at the moment. As a planner, it can be very frustrating sometimes because you want to solve all these things, but because there's not joined up thinking at national levels, let alone at local levels, you can't quite get there without taking the long road to that answer.
Well, thank you very much for coming to today's guest speaker talk.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. So I'm happy to take a few more questions. I'm probably going to have to shoot soon to do school pickup, but if there's anything else burning, do ask now.
Sorry, I'm just gonna quickly ask about nitrate and phosphate deposition, because I've read something about it, and I do understand like it basically causes like some issues with planning depending on the amount, and I understand it's like in the air. I want to say it's in the air, in the land. I don't know. Sorry, but I was wondering like how, like why does it have an impact like on planning, like a building, and
Yeah. So it's a good question because there's a lot of things that come across my desk in the course of, say, putting together a planning application or promoting a site where you think, why on earth does that have any relevance to my day-to-day job? And prepare yourselves, because if you go into the private sector practice or public sector practice, you're going to have to read a lot of stuff that you didn't think you'd ever have to read, like ground investigation reports and ecological reports on lesser horseshoe bats, and understanding where they come from and where they're going, and the fact that they're thriving over there because they eat cow poo. And you have to keep the cow poo, otherwise they're going to be very unhappy. Things like that. So phosphates and nitrous oxides and all those kinds of things, phosphates in particular, that's an important one at the moment because it's created a moratorium on development in Somerset. I can't tell you the full story because I've sat through some of the meetings and snored through some of the meetings. Ultimately, more people being delivered houses in certain areas will mean that there's more runoff of certain pollutants to protected rivers and ecological sites of importance, which will damage the ability of those habitats to thrive for the species that are important there. So what is having to happen at the moment is developers and local authorities and the statutory water companies and the Environment Agency are having to come up with a way of developer paying some money to a body that will then do good works that stop the rivers and habitats becoming less suitable for species. But ultimately, more housing causes the environment to stop those problems becoming really problematic. That's the really, really short answer to that. And yet another development contribution. And with that answer, I put everybody to sleep. I know. Oh, my life's so exciting.
Bravo.
Is there any more question to ask? No?
Yeah, I have a question. But this one it's a fun question. Well, not that fun, but anyways. Pineapple on pizza or no?
Always. Pineapple on pizza is brilliant.
Yes, I like you.
Any topping, any time. Who cares what anyone else thinks?
Yeah.
We live once, duckies. Get on with it and do what you want.
That's true.
I think that's a good note to end on. But if anyone wanted to get in touch with me, I'm happy for my details to be shared. If anyone wanted to send me an email or pick up the phone and just have a one-to-one, then go for it, because I've been sat in your positions, or similar positions anyway, and I know how frightening, lonely, worrying, amazing it can seem on the other side.
Thank you very much for coming again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me and letting me ramble at you.
Thank you so much.
Not a problem. Have